Welcome, Mercs. Gather around and take a seat. I imagine many of you are looking to make your fortunes in Night City, and you must be certain that that time is certainly coming. Quite soon, in fact, many of you will make your mark upon the city, whether you utilize your considerable cybernetics or mechanical prosthesis, or intend to utilize the net as a runner, maybe even a mix of many skill sets. Night City has the need for any desperate individual looking to carve out a small fortune. In between gang violence, the machinations of the ultra-rich, or the political intrigues of those therein, is boundless opportunity in the city for those with the will, no, the brutality to capture it. And make no mistake, this isn't a city for the weak-willed or yellow-bellied. This city will chew you up and spit out cowardice or the vain. It only respects one thing: ambition. But to get there, to understand how you can be of value to your employers in the Night City, you should understand some key contextual information. Night City is situated in the Free State of Northern California, somewhere between San Francisco and Morro Bay, with a population estimated to be well over 5 million. Now, to put that into perspective, in the early 21st century, just before the economic collapse, the population of New York City was around 8 million. So you'll be entering a city with roughly the same populace in arguably a smaller landmass. Now, as you'd imagine, this allows for a certain amount of classism to form. The super rich are protected by their comfy boardrooms, and they're a part of many mega corporations. Now, they live quite literally above the clouds in skyscrapers overlooking the peasantry, far from strife, chaos, and the interactions of the less fortunate. Night City is known to be the city on the edge of tomorrow, hosting millions of tourists and corporate travelers per year. But under its glamorous exterior lies a rot of corporate corruption, physical greed, and gang brutality. But before we can discuss more of the history of Night City, it is likely helpful to understand the world you occupy and where we've come since 1994. But how did the world, and specifically the United States, fall to such balkanization, such amount of chaos and corruption? Some conspiracy theorists would argue it had quite a bit to do with the so-called Gang of Four, or the operations of the United States government intelligence groups, such as the NSA, the CIA, FBI, and the DEA. Others would argue that the rise in power of corporations and the continued socio-economic inequality led to a perfect storm of typical government ineptitude mixed with rising social discomfort. In 1994, the World Stock Exchange crashes, leading to the eventual devaluation and removal of the US dollar as the world-leading currency, as the EEC, or the European Economic Community, gained considerable traction. The Gang of Four, fearful of the rising power within the European bloc, still allied with the US and a part of NATO, would lead several overt campaigns against their supposed European allies in what was called the Quiet War. In 1992, the USSR was struggling to reform itself following the end of the Cold War. America, the leading superpower and political driver of the dated evil empire narrative, continued to press their advantage against the European states within the Warsaw Pact, refusing to provide any aid, economic or food supply related, to any country suffering through the Soviet Reformation. However, since the rise of the EEC, the European powers became more bold in their political and military independence and actively defied the US-backed mandate of landlocked blockade of aid and support. As such, the Soviet nations, grateful to their closer European brothers, adopted the euro dollar over that of the US dollar. This eventually led to the collapse of NATO and the removal of Western international influence of the United States. The Gang of Four, ever unable to accept defeat, began a campaign of currency manipulation in European and Asian markets, falsely propping up the US dollar over that of the euro dollar, in some false sense of illusion. Now, this came at an incredible cost, and the EEC would eventually leak this information to the world media, forcing the US to respond. Unfortunately, The US, now bickered by internal miscommunication and relevant mismanagement, was unable to establish any narrative that countered the leaks. In response to these leaks, multiple first world countries established trade embargoes, further destabilizing the United States and leading to the events of the economic collapse within the United States. The actions of the Gang of Four, their complete inability to see past their own self-ambition and unorganization against the EEC, should provide some context as to why the US found itself in this position. Now, certainly, the rise of mega corporations around the world, the US sinking into an ostracized world trade position, and the consistent social inequality all played an impactful role in ushering in the economic collapse. But the event in 1996 further establishes the corruption and political infighting that plagued the United States. During these events, multiple socioeconomic classes of the US were affected. It wasn't just the retired elderly living off of their hard work multi-year labor pensions. It wasn't the wage slaves of the so-called middle class. It wasn't just some corporate or political elite class. All were affected by the following events, which had a profound impact on the world around us today, even in 2077, almost 100 years after the collapse. Now, you could argue that the collapse was not just an isolated incident, but rather over years of social and economic destructions with layers of reformation we're in. But in the case of this report, we should attempt to remove this speculation for another time. The collapse event is considerably compounded by the death of the US president and the vice president occurring within the same time frame at different sites within the United States. Some believe this event was further orchestrated by the Gang of Four, further showcasing their complete overreaching power these intelligence communities had. For a small time, the office of the president was left unoccupied. The US Senate would declare a multi-year martial law. Thousands of Americans would attempt to cash out their savings, municipal and state and federal bonds. When combined with considerable trade embargoes and the '94 stock market crash, the US dollar would become practically worthless in the span of a year. The path to reformation and reorganization would be a slow one. Many corporations, domestic and international, saw their opportunity to assert themselves as the US's savior, and for a time, the US would limp on, with a considerably weakened political elite, and a new power class flooded by corporate stakeholders and board members, creating a new US ruling power. Eventually, in 1998, the trade embargoes would end, led by various diplomatic concessions made by the US Senate. However, the greatest threat to American sovereignty, and potentially that of the world, lied within the still empowered deep state, the Gang of Four. Over time, the US would restabilize, but a majority of the world's borders were forever changed. Many countries, including China, Korea, and Japan, would go through similar reformations, rebellions, and civil wars. But there was one constant rising power: corporations, whether state-backed or otherwise, leading to a shift in global power, at least over time. However, these corporations were not just economic competitors. Many of these power-hungry, product-producing entities also look for other ways, sometimes very overt, to undermine their opponents in bids to capture more market share. In 2004, the first recorded corporate war began between the Electronic Business Machines, or EBM, and Orbital Air. EBM at the time was looking to purchase TWA, or Trans World Airlines. However, due to some corporate intrigue, the CEO of TWA let the original buyout fall through, looking to sell to a higher bidder in Orbital Air. Now, once EBM realized what had occurred, they hired terrorists to hijack the Orbital Air business acquisition team. However, in a stroke of complete misfortune, the terrorists failed their objective, leading to a leak of EBM employing terrorists to forcefully imply their ambition. Now, it doesn't stop there. In a constant threat of escalation and overt conflict, the corporations began to hire various firms with different disciplines. Some were occupied with cyber warfare, others were mercenaries prepared to inflict massive collateral damage to physical facilities. Others operated PR and traditional media-based attacks of defamation. Now, this wasn't just a simple commercial ad set to air for 30 seconds, targeting above the line. This was forcible marketing on steroids, where there was no clear winner. When the smoke finally cleared, both companies and many more smaller corps involved lost untold hundreds of millions of euro dollars. And this was only the first corporate war. The second corporate war between Sovoil and Petrochem was started based on an accident in one of Petrochem's offshore facilities. Now, Petrochem believed that Sovoil sabotaged it, and war ensued, with both companies losing roughly 75% of their operational capacity, only for Petrochem to discover the initial offshore drilling event was nothing more than mere coincidence. The third corporate war had no actual front lines, at least when you consider the physical space, as battlegrounds were on the net, the massive digital communication ecosystem utilized in almost all of daily life by 2015. Now remember, the net is relatively connected to everything. Toasters, cars, air vehicles, cybernetics. Everything with an electronic pulse has some style of communication with the net. And the corporations of Merrill, Ascucaga, Finch, or MAFs against the Rothstein Fund, a subsidiary of the New York Bank, would begin with war. The fourth corporate war began in 2021, where the world almost experienced another collapse, when IHAG, a corp focused on underwater shipping and technology, went bankrupt, and the two rival aquacorps, as they were called, Sino and OTEC, began net-based attacks, eventually escalating to physical warfare and proxy battles across the world. These corporations could field well-stocked armies and supplied, ranging in the tens of thousands, operating with incredible military-capable technology. Fighting would spill out over various US and Japanese cities, effectively a war between US and Japanese corporations. Cities like Tokyo, Washington, and even our Night City saw portions of fighting and destruction. The local governments of the US and Japan were practically forced to defend sovereign facilities as this war became overt acts of aggressions by other corporations, forcing militaries on both sides to defend against US-based or Japanese-based corps. Clearly, you can see a potential problem of corporate power and monopoly run rampant when supported by traditional territorial boundaries of world governments. By 2025, the fourth corporate war had finally come to a close, but not after considerable damage to the world economy, infrastructure, and the political influence of both the US and Japan. Hopefully, at this point, the world is set, at least in some parts. There is so much potential information to share with you mercenaries, regardless if some of you aren't particularly interested in the world history. This should help provide more meaningful context to the rise of corporations and the current state of the world. In the next report, I hope to shed more light on your new home, regardless if you make it or not in Night City. I'll attempt to provide more context to that home, or what was once supposed to be called Coronado City. The factions that occupy it, its current trials and tribulations, the home corporations, your potential employers, and how you can eke out some form of a living. In the meantime, I suggest you attempt to stay safe, as I know many of you are eager to accept any opportunity to further your fame and wealth, potentially at the cost of your lives. But such is the life of a mercenary, is it not? Hey everyone, I hope this provides a bit more backstory on the history of Cyberpunk, as obviously there is more world building than the new title led by CD Projekt Red. By the way, I'm very, very excited to play that. I hope a lot of you guys are as well. I've gotten a lot of great Deus Ex, Shadowrun vibes from this lore report, and I hope you've kind of gotten that vibe too. If there is enough interest here, I'm happy to go into more detail in the lore of the world, as there is just an abundance of information. A lot of it is from the Cyberpunk Wikipedia, but there's some more spread all across the internet. Happy to get course corrected here. This is not a super let's call it relevant topic for me, so I'm sure I've made a couple errors in this video. Please feel free to call them out. I particularly focused on the US position from 1990 to 2050, but the entire world goes through this incredible divergent timeline. So the Soviet Union still sort of exists, the European Union is the powerhouse, or the EEC. There are multiple wars in Central America. Los Angeles gets hit by like a 10.0 earthquake. Basically, 100,000 little things happen that flesh out the dystopia of Cyberpunk's background narrative, and it does it in a great way that does tend to make a lot of sense. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Now with that, I'm out, and more lore coming this Sunday.